Hi listeners, Jason here from Spiritualbabies.net. Joining me again this week is Rabbi Federow, the author of the fantastic website What Jews Believe, and also the book Judaism and Christianity, A Contrast. Welcome back again, Rabbi Stewart.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here with you.
We had our first meeting last week. It went really well. We had a lot of really good feedback, which is great. And if you're listening and you have a question, please forward it to us and we can address it on the show.
Absolutely.
We are going to this week have a look at one of your essays, that one person cannot die for the sins of another. We dealt with this very briefly last week, but I thought we could dedicate the whole portion of the show towards this question as it's quite important. Your book title, Judaism and Christianity, A Contrast, is really about the differences between the two faiths, right? It's not just about the fact that they're different, it's that they're diametrically different.
Incompatible, irreconcilably different. It's not just that we disagree, it's that you cannot believe in both at the same time. They are fundamentally on the opposite sides of the spectrum, one from the other.
And so if we were to visit a Christian church and ask what the faith involved, they would say that belief in this man Yeshua, Jesus, and the fact that he died on the cross means that the sins that we've committed during our lives are washed away, and that the death that comes through Scripture because of sin has now been lifted.
Let me quickly tell you a scene that gets played out every so often in my house, or sometimes even in my synagogue. I will get people who will do the door-to-door missionizing, and frankly, Jason, maybe I shouldn't do it this way, but I do. I welcome them with open arms. And I may even say something like, I've been reading the Bible and God must have sent you to me because I have questions, which is totally true. God may have sent them to me and I do have questions. I invite them in and they ask me, if they can tell me or talk to me about their personal experience. In other words, they're witnessing. I let them go through their witnessing. Usually they come with their own Bible. I ask them if I could see their Bible. I go to one particular verse in the Bible, Deuteronomy 24:16. I hold the place. I ask them, tell me in one sentence exactly what Jesus did for you. And they have to say, he died for my sins. Then I open up the Bible to their Bible to Deuteronomy 24:16. I hand it to them and I ask them to read out loud that verse, which reads, no man shall be put to death for the sins of his children. No child will be put to death for the sins of his parents. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. And as soon as they read that, they have nothing more to say. Because they say, Jesus died for my sin, and they read the verse that said, every man is put to death for his own sin. Diametrically opposite, incompatible, irreconcilably different.
There are some that might say that Jesus wasn't just a man and that he was a God, and therefore that doesn't count.
Right. To which I would respond, who did the dying on the cross? Was it in fact Jesus the God, or was it Jesus the human being? But if it was Jesus the God, I thought God can't die by definition. If God can die, God isn't God. So the entity on the cross that did the dying to save humanity from their sins was Jesus the human, which means they're basing their religion on human sacrifice. And what does God call human sacrifice? An abomination, something he hates. And then I believe it's in Jeremiah, God calls human sacrifice such a horrible thing it wouldn't even come into his mind to demand from people to do.
You shall not let your children pass through the fires.
Exactly. And Christians will say, they didn't sacrifice their own children, it was somebody else's children, as if that's then okay.
But I suppose that way around. If Jesus is the Son of God, then that would be God sacrificing his Son.
Well, no, it would be God sacrificing himself, because somehow they're supposed to be one and the same, even though the New Testament is explicitly clear that Jesus does not have the same will as the Father. Remember in Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but your will be done. So their will is not the same. Someone asks him, can I sit at your right hand? He said, it's not up to me to give, so he doesn't have the same power as the Father. So they're separate, they're unequal, they're not the same, which parenthetically is a good example of polytheism.
And so then we might have a lot of people they want two witnesses when they look at the text, which I think is fair. Oftentimes if you see a concept in the Bible, you want to see it repeated, so you've got an established idea. So if we were to knock away Deuteronomy 24:16,
absolutely,
and we say, well, that's just a one-off.
Well, there are at least three other ones. The first one in the biblical narrative probably is Exodus. I'm sure everybody remembers the story of the Jews with the golden calf. Moses comes down, sees the golden calf, and this is after he destroys the first 10 commandments. And then he says, I don't know what to do. Maybe I can go up and I can obtain forgiveness for their sin. He doesn't know what to do because it's never happened before. So he goes up to God and he says, forgive these people for the great sin that they've committed, or blot me out of the book which you have written. What he's saying is, punish me for their sin. And what's the book about? Well, it could be the book of life, and he's saying, kill me for their sin. But also, Jason, we don't know what that book is. That book could be it could be who gets dessert after breakfast, after lunch, after dinner. The point is that to be written out of that book means to be punished, whatever that book means. And so to be written out of that book means to be punished, and Moses is saying, punish me for their sin. He goes up to God and he says, forgive these people for the sin, or write me out of the book which you have written. And God says, doesn't work that way. The person who has committed the sin is the one who gets written out of that book. So whatever the punishment is, it's the person who does the sin who gets written out of that book. It means that nobody else can be punished for someone else's sin. And Jason, we need to be clear about something. When Christianity says that he died for my sin, or he died for me, it means that the guilt that I have for any and all sins that I have committed, or that have been committed from generations past, like the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the original sin from which I suffer, that this death is taking away that guilt, okay? It's not saying like a soldier who jumps on a hand grenade to save the lives of his buddies. Okay, he died to save them, but his death doesn't take away the sins of those soldiers that he saved.
And I guess one of the biggest issues there is that if his death did take away the sins of the world, we shouldn't suffer from any of that guilt and sin now, because that event has happened, right? It's actually the belief that happened that is what gives them the relief from this sin.
Exactly. It's accepting his sacrifice on the cross like a blood sacrifice for our sin, which goes to probably next time we talk discussion about the Christian misconception that you have to have a blood sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin.
So the title of this essay is Jews Believe That One Person's Death Cannot Atone for the Sins of Another. So if we are going to talk about atonement, we carry that guilt ourselves.
We carry the guilt of our own choices. In other words, we don't inherit guilt from someone else. That actually is a third reference to the idea that no one else can die for your sin. If you take a look at Ezekiel, the 18th chapter, the entire 18th chapter, all of it, is devoted to basically two ideas. That we do not inherit guilt for sin from someone else, and that someone else's death cannot take away our guilt for our own sins. There are two concepts running there in the book of in the 18th chapter of the book of Ezekiel.
And Ezekiel 18 runs. There's no gray area in Ezekiel 18, is there? I mean,
no. It says the righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. It doesn't say the wickedness of the wicked shall be on the righteous. It does. If that were true, then that would be like saying the righteousness of the righteous is on the wicked.
Right, and if a wicked person repents and turns to righteousness,
exactly what it says. Then all that he has done okay, that was evil will be forgotten, will not even be mentioned. It's gone. Doesn't exist.
And which sacrifices does he have to bring for that to happen?
No blood sacrifice, no death of an animal or, God forbid, a human. Recognize you've done something wrong. Repent for the sins that you've committed. Stop doing the bad. Start doing the good, and God forgives. And repeatedly, the Bible says this. Take a look at the book of Jonah. Okay, third chapter. Jonah has already made his in the original Hebrew, 5-word prophecy to the people of Nineveh. Another 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. He doesn't even mention the word sin. But the people of Nineveh, the people that he's preaching to, understand. And the king of Nineveh makes a proclamation. And basically he says, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, drink or eat anything, which is called fasting. And by the way, that's what we do on Yom Kippur, is we fast. He says in this edict, he says, let everyone cry mightily to God, which is another way of saying to pray, which is also what we do on Yom Kippur. We pray the whole day long. And then it says that the people stop their evil ways. And the king says, who knows if we stop our evil that God will repent, that God will not do these things to us, that God will forgive us, basically. And it's interesting because the text explicitly says, and God saw their works, not their faith, not that somebody hundreds of years later were going to die for their sins, but God saw their works. What works? That they stopped doing the evil and God forgave them. It's that simple. Stop doing the bad, start doing the good, and God forgives you.
No sacrifices, no blood.
No blood sacrifice wherever necessary. We'll get into this more, I'm sure, next week.
So it reminds me a little bit of Genesis 4:7 when God comes to Cain. And Cain he's at that point, he's thinking that he's a bit annoyed. His brother's really frustrating him and he's going to go over and club his brother to death. And God comes to him and says, sin is crouching at your door.
Jason, you left out a very important phrase.
I always do.
And I don't mind telling you that most Christians intentionally or by accident leave the same phrase out when they refer to that. Sin is crouching at the door, but you can master it. Remember, the Bible is explicitly clear. It says, sin is crouching at the door, but you can master it.
And so at that point, even though Cain has considered his actions and has maybe got his mind set on it, he could have just turned around and said, no, I'm not going to, and corrected his ways and carried on.
Exactly. Stop doing the bad, start doing the good. Look, remember what happened leading up to that point. They are both, Cain and Abel are going to bring a sacrifice to God, okay? The text is explicitly clear. Cain grabs whatever's at hand, but Abel picks the choicest of the flock.
Is it worth looking at the word sacrifice just very quickly? I mean, it doesn't state a sin sacrifice in that verse, does it?
No, of course not.
It's just a sacrifice is another word for an offering. You're giving something of yours.
And remember something, all blood sacrifices were for unintentional sin. We'll get into that later too, I'm sure. Okay, that's one thing. Second of all, you have to remember that the vast majority of sacrifices that were ever brought to the temple had absolutely nothing to do with sin. There were numerous other reasons why a person may want to bring a sacrifice. There was a whole burnt offering. There were Thanksgiving sacrifices, well-being sacrifices. Read Leviticus, first few chapters. It's all listed there. It gives you the various kinds of sacrifices. But it's interesting. Cain, Christians will make a big deal out of Abel bringing the food sacrifice, and they'll say, "Oh, see, blood sacrifice," and that wasn't the issue. The issue is that Abel brought the choicest. Cain just grabbed what was at hand. So it would be like me being the rabbi of my synagogue and having a potluck dinner or something, and all the people who brought food are sitting there watching me eat, and if I pick one person's tuna salad instead of another person's tuna salad, should the person whose tuna salad I didn't pick, should that person be upset? And if I see that one tuna salad is of the choicest kind of tuna, whatever they call it, and the other one doesn't look so nice, okay, It's my taste. It's God. God picked one over the other because it was the choicest, like a buffet, smorgasbord. Cain had no reason to take insult from it, but he chose to.
The text says often that he was wrought, but I think that the words actually mean something like his face was down, or it was...
Right, his countenance fell. Because, when somebody hurts your feelings, you don't look up bright, you look down, you look downcast. And that's what that refers to.
I've heard the argument that it was the fact that Abel was sacrificing a lamb.
Right, that's what I mean. But it's not... the issue isn't what they sacrificed. The issue was the quality of what they sacrificed. Abel chose the choicest. Cain grabbed what was at hand. So his offering wasn't as nice.
And then God goes to Cain and he says, why are you so upset? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted?
Yes, because it's the behavior that counts. Okay, it's if you do what's right, you will be accepted.
And that echoes back to Ezekiel 18 again.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So I'm looking at Malachi 3:6. For I am the creator, I change not. Therefore, the sons of Jacob are not consumed. Can you elaborate on that verse a little bit and why you've included that as the last text on your essay?
Okay. God comes to the Jewish people through the Torah, through the prophets, repeatedly makes the same statements to them that... here's how it works, people. Stop doing the bad, start doing the good, I will forgive you. Nobody else can die for your sin. The wickedness of the wicked is on the wicked, not on the righteous. And then all of a sudden Christianity comes along and says, no, it's different. You need a blood sacrifice, and Jesus, the human being, was that sacrifice, and his sacrifice takes away your sin. If God doesn't change as we are taught in that passage, when did God change his mind? When did God gather the Jewish people at Sinai again to say, I changed my mind, and from now on, it's going to be the exact opposite of what I've been telling you for 1,000 years. By the way, Jason, that's another thing about all this, and that is the first thing you have to ask is, what sense does it make to anybody that one person's death should take away the guilt of a sin of somebody else? If you talk to children, if you ask two children, okay, you say, Billy stole a candy bar from Jane. Billy stole a candy bar from Jane. If you ask Billy and Jane, does it make sense that Bob gets punished for when Billy stole the candy bar from Jane? The children will say, that makes no sense, that's not right. And if you ask the same children, Billy and Jane, if you say, what happens if he volunteers to have this happen? They'll look puzzled and they'll say, why would he do that? And it still doesn't make sense. Because they know in their hearts as children that the person who does the thing that's wrong is the person who should get the punishment for it.
I wonder, though, if someone came to Billy and said, look, Bob's willing to take the rap for you. You don't have to feel responsible for your actions, whether he'd lap that up.
Oh, he would lap it up, but in his gut, he would still think something's wrong. And something is wrong with the idea that this other kid wants to be punished for something I did. He'd feel guilt from it. He'd be relieved because he's a child, but he'd still know in his heart that something was wrong with it. God does not change his mind. Okay, we discussed that from Malachi chapter 3. But there are verses in the Hebrew scriptures that Christians will look to justify their Christian concept that, oh yes, one man can die for the sins of someone else. One example of that is in Isaiah 53. And so you have to ask the question, again, when did God change his mind? Because if Deuteronomy 24:16 explicitly says, every man shall be put to death for his own sin, ish b'chet'o yumatu, okay, if every man shall be put to death for his own sin, and you jump to an interpretation, and remember that's what it is, just an interpretation of Isaiah 53, that it says, oh no, this servant suffers for the people and takes away their sin by his death, you have to ask, when did God change his mind between Deuteronomy and Isaiah 53? And if God doesn't change his mind, then the interpretation of Isaiah 53 has to be the wrong interpretation because it contradicts the clear meaning of what we just discussed in Deuteronomy 24:16, every man shall be put to death for his own sin. You cannot have it both ways. Christians will also take a look at various sections of rabbinic writings, and they will misinterpret those, again, to give credibility to the concept that, yes, one person can die for the sins of another. But it's only their interpretation, and even if it was a Jewish interpretation that actually said that, if it contradicts what we know from the Hebrew scriptures, that part of what those individual rabbis said has to be rejected as well.
So we always go back to the Torah for our truth.
Got to go back to the Torah. You've got to go back to the Tanakh. You've got to go to those verses that are simple and clear and to the point and don't need to be interpreted to understand. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. Ish, man, b'chet-o, we know chata is sin, okay? In his own sin, yumatu shall be put to death. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. It's clear, it's concise, it's to the point. It doesn't need to be interpreted. It matches other verses that we've already discussed, that no one else can die for your sin. And then if you take a look at these Talmudic passages that they misinterpret, misrepresent, mistranslate, just as they take a look at Isaiah 53 that they misrepresent, misinterpret, and mistranslate, then you have to reject it because it contradicts what we have in the Tanakh.
And just to be clear, the Talmud doesn't say that Jesus is the Son of God and he's come to die for the sins of the world.
No, of course not. No, of course not. Of course not. And if Christians try to say that it does say that, they're giving it an interpretation. And I can take any verse in the Bible or in the Talmud or in Moby Dick, okay, or in Shakespeare, and I can give it any interpretation I feel like giving it. And no one else can say I'm wrong, except they don't like it and they've got their own interpretation. But if I have a clear, concise, to the point, easily understood sentence in the Bible that this interpretation contradicts, then the interpretation must be wrong and must be rejected.
And so, listeners, I strongly recommend that you go visit whatjewsbelieve.org and read the whole essay. It's pretty awesome. And for a more in-depth look into this subject and many more, there are links on that website to buy the book, Judaism and Christianity, A Contrast. We'll be back again next week. I want to thank you, Rabbi, for coming and visiting today.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for listening. Leave comments below if you have questions, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.